Prime Minister Narendra Modi is all set to visit Ukraine and Poland later this month. The visit is significant in view of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's last visit to Russia, which came under criticism from the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. It is being looked at as a balancing act by India in wake of the Ukraine-Russia war. The visit comes at a time when there has been fresh escalation seen from the Ukrainian side, which has taken control of Russian territory of Kursk. Earlier this year, in June, Prime Minister Narendra Modi met President Zelensky on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Italy. During the meeting, both leaders discussed the Russia-Ukraine war, and the Prime Minister emphasized India's support for a peaceful solution back then. He then echoed the same sentiment while meeting the President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, in Moscow in July. As Putin rolled out the red carpet at the Kremlin, Prime Minister Narendra Modi conveyed that the solution to the war is not possible on the battlefield and India is ready to cooperate in all ways for restoration of peace. Prime Minister's visit to Kiev is no mean feat. It holds immense significance. He is perhaps one of the few world leaders who can visit Moscow and Kiev, maintain equally stable bilateral ties with both nations, and at the same time have the potential to be a peace negotiator to end this war. At a time when the war is intensifying further, it is the Ukrainians and the Russians that are losing their lives. It is the Europeans that have been bankrupted. And at the same time, it is the Americans who are minting money from this war. As calls for bringing an end to the senseless fighting continues, will Prime Minister Modi's visit help India forge a peace pact between Ukraine and Russia? Let's start off our conversation. Joining me on the telecast, Ambassador Mahesh Sachdev. And Ambassador, what do you think is the significance of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Poland and then to Ukraine, keeping in mind just a month ago he was in Austria and Russia?
I think it's quite significant. It is a major initiative. Poland visit is after, I think, 40 years that an Indian Prime Minister has been visiting Poland. And Ukraine, I have no instant memory of any Indian Prime Minister having visited since Ukraine was formed out of Soviet Union in mid-1990s. I think the current conflict between Ukraine and Russia adds additional value to this this visit, and it would be somewhat premature to expect too much out of it. But in itself, it's a major Indian initiative. India normally shies away from mediation in conflicts. This visit would be an exception, and I think it would speak of major initiative and effort by the Prime Minister, who has met both Presidents Zelensky and Mr. Putin recently, and might have some conviviality, some aspect of the possible peace deal between them in mind. It'll be, given the bitterness, given the historical baggage that the two sides have had, and given the acute polarization that conflict has resulted, I think it'll be foolhardy to expect too much to come out of this visit of less than a day to Minsk and to Kiev, I'm sorry, and therefore it'll be wait and watch. It may open a new vista. It may add to the gravity of finding a harmonious solution, because have been made in the recent times to avoid this senseless war going into its second 2 years and a half. And when winter is approaching, it could get even worse. So I think with the incipient presidency changes in the United States, with Europeans increasingly desperate for a solution, with NATO it at its wits' end to funnel aid and armament to Ukraine to prop it up against a much bigger enemy. It is the right time for somebody like Prime Minister Modi to take an initiative. Let's hope that it has some success.
Ben Harris, who is the editor-in-chief of BNE and former Moscow bureau chief of Daily Telegraph, also on the telecast with me. Ben, how do you view, first of all, the Prime Minister visiting President Putin in Russia, which came under heavy criticism, particularly from the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky? This was happening at the same time that there was a NATO summit that was taking place in Washington, D.C. And the visit that is forthcoming of Prime Minister in Kiev is being looked upon as some sort of a balancing act. Do you agree to that?
Yeah, balancing is a good word to use here, in so much as since this conflict has started, the world has been split into two camps. The West, G7 extended, plus Canada, Japan, and on the other side is the so-called global South. And Russia is been signaling, for months now that it's willing to start ceasefire talks. But at the same time, so is Zelensky. Ukraine is facing an atrocious situation that is running out of men, of money, and from munitions as well. Moreover, half the power sector has been destroyed. And so this winter is going to be horrible in Ukraine. There's no power, no heating. And indeed, here in Berlin, we're expecting another 1 million Ukrainian refugees. So given both sides are signaling that they're getting tired of the war, then they need a mediator in order to bring the talks around, because tensions are very high, animosity is very high, and there's very little common ground. And specifically, India has positioned itself in the middle, talking to both camps. I mean, India maintains good relations with the West, with the US, and at the same time, good relations with Moscow. I mean, Modi, as you know, was in Moscow in July and did a number of deals and said that we won't be badgered by the West. We will represent our own interests, which is not to say it's a Russian ally per se, but it's certainly, still trading, doing business, importing oil, fertilizers from Russia. And that puts Modi into an excellent position to play the middleman. And Zelensky and Kiev, I mean, they're unhappy with anybody that talks to Putin. But, in a conflict, you need someone who can talk to both sides. And I think as part of India's larger aspirations, to step up to the top table in geopolitics, that this is a role that India was interested in playing, being a major player in a major geopolitical conflict where it has major sway and influence and it can actually bring about a peace deal. So I think balance is exactly what he's trying to do, is trying to find a balance between the interests of both sides and to bring this conflict to an end, which is having economic consequences for the whole world, the energy markets, for commodity markets, and everybody's suffering from it.
Okay. Major General Sudhakar ji, does this come as a surprise that the Prime Minister is making this maiden trip to Ukraine? I don't think there has been any Indian state of head that has ever visited the country.
Megha, good evening. Thank you for getting me to your show. Compliments to the co-panelists. They deserve to have the last say in their perspective about the subject under discussion. I must compliment you to start with the preamble, the opening narrative, which has been elucidated by you, par excellent, and there lies the answer. I don't think that today in the geopolitical scenario as prevailing in the world, be it start from the pandemic, thereafter, the disruption in the supply chain, followed by the the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian war or the conflict, and followed by what is happening in the Middle East, I think the world is going through a journey of war fatigue. The whole world, except for one country, mindlessly, despite being a superpower, yet they have not been talking about peace. They have been actually stoking fire as to how the conflict can go on eternally. I'm sorry to say and point out that there has not been any sincere attempt by any party, any stakeholder, even if the meeting and in Switzerland a couple of months back was aiming to bring some kind of a solution, lasting solution. That also landed up as a one-sided, our co-panelist, the way he has brought out, as a kind of ex parte, one-sided kind of a narrative, fostering the conflict, which is actually pushing Ukraine into a mindless war. So therefore, I think to my understanding and very limited exposure one has had in track 2, I suppose that before the Prime Minister of India has taken a step to go to Ukraine at this point in time, I'm certain about things that some kind of a basic framework and effort would have gone in from the diplomats and the officials of India who are looking after the subject, unless the cost benefit analysis tilts in favor of some degree of success. I do not think our honorable and most experienced and credible Prime Minister of India would have stepped in for such a kind of a risk, because I visualize that it's not an easy deal to bring about peace between two separate groups, as has been outlined by the earlier speakers.
Okay.
And these two groups have been created by none other than the Western alliances. So therefore, a stakeholder as that of India, who is actually being accepted by the two parties into the conflict, I think this is the best bet that India can exercise and bring about a lasting peace by firstly ensuring ceasefire. Secondly, based on as is, where is basis, we need to stabilize our borders and thereafter carry out negotiations,
Okay.
maybe the Minsk Accord 1 and 2.
Okay.
Back to you, Mary.
Okay, all right. Professor Swaran Singh, the motive behind Prime Minister meeting President Putin and now visiting Kiev has been underlined several times in the various multilateral meetings and summits that have taken place. And I would like to put it in this one sentence which Prime Minister Modi echoed the sentiment of India. भारत ने विश्व को बुद्ध दिया है, युद्ध नहीं. And that has been the overarching theme of India's stance when it comes to the Ukraine-Russia war. There have been several times in the past that our External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has spoken about how Europe and the West thinks that the problems in the West become the problems of the world, but the problems of the rest of the world are not really important for the West to tackle or take cognizance of. And how does India's role now come into the picture, where these visits at this point of time in Kiev, in Poland, he was in Austria, he was in Russia. What does this indicate to the West? What does it indicate to NATO, to America?
Megha, this visit is necessitated, or shall we say, flows from India's essential foreign policy axis being strategic autonomy. And it is necessitated by that. Of course, also by civilizational DNA of, as you mentioned, India has given the world Buddha and not Yuddha, which is fine. Now, whether this was a surprise or was it expected, I think it was quite expected. From 8th of July, when Indian Prime Minister was going to Moscow, speculations had started from then onwards as to when Indian Prime Minister is going to visit Kiev also. Now, his visit to Moscow, which has kind of seen a very harsh response from particularly United States, starting from President himself, Secretary of State, US Ambassador in Delhi, could have added to it, but I don't believe that. I believe it is flowing out of India's assertion of strategic autonomy, which it has sustained throughout, particularly on issue of Ukraine war. Before that Moscow visit, I think we all need to remember also that a seamlessly annual bilateral summit of Russia and India did not take place in pandemic, but also did not take place in 2022 and 2023. Indian Prime Minister decided not to visit. I think that has to be underlined and appreciated. And then, of course, finally, Indian Prime Minister went there in 8th and 9th of July this year. And from day one, speculations were that perhaps the way he conducted himself during the meetings, and of course, the expectation that he will soon be going to Kiev was always on cards. So it is simply assertion of India's central axis of strategic autonomy. Now remember, he is visiting Kiev on a very significant day. Verkhovna Rada, which is the parliament of Ukraine, in 1991 on 24th of August had declared independence. And this is the Independence Day of Ukraine, which is often celebrated with not just parades, but concerts and fireworks and so on. Of course, during war, it has been a bit subdued. So look at the day Indian Prime Minister is choosing to be in Kiev. And of course, we also are reading now a sudden unannounced visit of the Deputy National Security Advisor, Pavan Kapoor, also just took place to Kiev to finally, see what can be the outcome of Indian Prime Minister's visit. It's fine to say that India has always mentioned that we need to immediately stop these violence, go back to dialogue and discussions and diplomacy, and has offered whatever India can do to, take this process forward. Exactly same language was reiterated by the Chief of Staff of President of Ukraine, saying there is a whole effort process of peace in which India can play a definitely important role. So I think fine-tuning the final language of what will be the statement coming out of Prime Minister's visit to Kiev is, I think, now more or less finalized, and Indian Prime Minister will be going there. Remember, he'll be using train from Poland to Kiev to go using the railways, which also raises issues of safety and security and so on. Of course, many other international leaders have done that likewise. But I think we need to appreciate the fact that India has also not just sustained a very close relationship with Russia, which is not just now defense cooperation centric, but also $65 billion of energy transactions that are taking place between Russia and India. But despite that very strong relationship, the language of India has been very dynamic and changing in last 2.5 years, starting with saying we are concerned, we regret, and so on. But in August of 2022, when Bucha massacre happened, India called for an international investigation. Then, of course, we remember Samarkand SCO summit and the famous dialogue of Indian Prime Minister, this era is not era of war. Last year in Hiroshima, G7 summit, where Indian Prime Minister is always invited as special invitee, he said no nation should be allowed unilaterally to change international boundaries. And now, sitting in Moscow again on 8th of July, 9th of July, Indian Prime Minister underlined, as the bombing took place in Kiev and civilians died there, he said, in middle of bombing, no peace talks can either be anticipated or will lead to any results.
Okay.
So yes, language has been constantly changing, and West does understand that, and they have reconciled to India's strategic autonomy. They repeatedly try to make pressure. So I wouldn't see that visit is resulting from the Western pressures. It flows from India's strategic autonomy that India keeps asserting on all issues.
Okay. Ambassador Sachdev, keeping everything in mind, do you think India's growing role in trying to act as a mediator, can India be looked upon by the West to be a possible candidate in ensuring, or at least trying to ensure, that peace prevails as a ceasefire vis-a-vis what Turkey during significant points of time has been trying to do as well?
Thank you, Megha. You've raised an important issue, and it will be premature to judge it or predict the outcome. I would also like to mention that peace making in this conflict was tried by President Macron of France, President Erdogan of Turkey, President Xi, who even offered a 15-point plan for the ceasefire and cessation of hostilities. All of them failed. And I think one would have to be slightly cautious about it. Of course, in the recent times, no such visit as Prime Minister Modi's has taken place to Kiev, and one doesn't have a rule book or a precedent to go with it. So therefore, one would like to be slightly cautious. And at the same time, one should say that both sides have had a long battle of attrition. Front lines have been largely remained static, but for the Kursk incursion in the last 1 week, it's almost been frozen into a deadlock. Issues such as denazification of Ukraine, joining NATO, etc., are no longer being bandied in Moscow. Similarly, the need for Ukraine to be member of various strategic organizations like NATO, European Union, etc., is not being insisted upon with that kind of fervor as it was in the past. So the stage is now set for the two antagonists to be more realistic about what can be a peace deal attained and consist of. Thank you.
Okay, Ben, coming back to you now, there have been similar visits that have also been made in the recent time by the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. Yes, Orbán.
Yeah.
And again, he visited President Putin in Moscow. There was a visit that was made in Kiev as well, and then he headed to Beijing to meet Premier Xi Jinping. Now, why do you think there has been a flurry of activity from, smaller countries in Europe to intervene into the matter? There you see India also at this point of time, projecting itself as a significant actor in the state of affairs. It's keeping in mind that what happens in Ukraine and Russia, and if the war continues to expand and continue for, next few months or years, it is going to be adversely impacting the rest of the world.
Indeed. I mean, we're now in the third year of this war, and the Ukraine fatigue is now very palpable, and particularly here in Europe. War's been dragging on, and after the initial flurry and enthusiasm for the war in 2022, when Ukraine made this spectacular resistance and did far more than anyone was expecting, in the first year, it looked like it might even win. But then there was the failed counteroffensive last summer. And that was the last crucial point, I think, where Ukraine was supposed to break through the lines and rout the Russians. And it just didn't happen. And as the ambassador was saying, ever since then, we've been locked in this stalemate. At the same time, the cost of the war has been mounting. And, Russia's economy is actually growing quite strongly, 3.6 last year, 3.8 this year. However, Europe, the whole of Europe, is falling into recession, and the costs, the energy costs have gone shooting up, the inputs have gone shooting up. Germany started to deindustrialize; it's lost 10% of its heavy industry, and the growth across Europe. I mean, we're on the verge of recession, or everyone's growing at like less than 1%. And so these are all contributing to the fatigue, and Ukraine itself is starting to get tired because it's a grinding war of attrition. And although the Kursk incursion has been extremely uplifting, I mean, if you listen carefully and read between the lines what Ukraine's allies are saying, I think few people think that it can hang on to Kursk for any length of time. At best, the assumption is that Zelensky did this ahead of the mooted November peace talks, so that he's got a territory card. And he can trade Kursk for Zaporizhzhia or one of the 4 annexed regions or what have you. And it's a pragmatic gambit, if you like, a very high-risk one. But then it means everybody's pushing for it. So Orbán was a good example. I mean, he's pretty much the only leader in Europe that remains good ties with Putin, has actually seen him personally since the war started. And now that Hungary took over the EU presidency the 1st of July, he thought he'd play that card and go and see Putin and Zelensky and see if there's any common ground for this talk, which, as I said earlier, both of them want.
Okay. Quickly then, Professor Swaran Singh, can India at this point project itself as a world leader if it does not involve itself in the matters that are at this time consuming the West, consuming Europe?
I think India has been a peacemaking voice from the time it became independent. Lately, this is also seen in comparison to China emerging as a major peacemaker, particularly after Saudi Arabia, Iran shaking hands, etc. And of course, 13-point peace proposal of Wang Yi for Ukraine last year. We need to appreciate that Russia, that started from asking for security guarantees from United States and NATO, that it will never expand any further, has now come down to saying that Ukraine should just take a pledge that it will not join NATO. And in worst case scenario, they have created two small republics, Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic next door to them. That explains that Russia historically, whether it is Tsarist Russia or it is Soviet Russia or now Russian Federation, they have always viewed national security by creating buffers between them and their adversaries. So worst come worst, they have created the smallest Donetsk and Luhansk as two small states, buffers between them. But definitely, I think there is an increasing fatigue on both sides, and there is a possibility that two sides are looking for some kind of face-saving solution here. You mentioned of Viktor Orban visiting all the three places. He's known among NATO countries to be soft or closer to Moscow in that sense. So he definitely had his role to play. Macron had tried it before. This is the time when Indian Prime Minister is now kind of putting his hat into the ring in that sense of what India can bring to the table. And I think the fact that visit is taking place must mean that there is enough groundwork already done, and cost-benefit analysis have been already made in New Delhi before such an important visit takes place. So hopefully, if not immediately, this could start some kind of process, because that is what Chief of Staff of President of Ukraine has underlined, that there is a whole process in which India can play an important role. So I think we should look at how incrementally this visit could, either accelerate or initiate a process where India's role will be known much later as having contributed towards ensuring peace and building or starting initiatives of peace in this long prolonged war, which has impacted much of the world, as is said by other panelists.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.